What's going on, guys? We're having a great day today. Today we're going to be continuing our discussion in the book of Job. We're going to be in chapter 41. And we're going to be doing this teaching a little bit differently. I'm going to break it up in maybe 2 or 3 episodes or teaching lessons going to Job chapter 41. And I'm not going to go necessarily in order, verse by verse, but really we're going to be looking first at the description of the physical appearance of the Leviathan. And so we're going to be jumping around in chapter 41, and we're actually going to go to other passages in Job, or in the Bible, like Psalm and Isaiah, to look at other descriptions of the Leviathan to give us a clearer picture of what the Leviathan might actually be. But sort of like the Behemoth, it's very important that we recognize that the actual identity, the exact identity of the Leviathan is not of theological importance. That's not to say that it doesn't matter. Of course, all the scripture is good, all the scripture is profitable. But the actual identity of the Leviathan is not going to change someone's theology about God. Right? The same conclusion is what we are to draw, that God made everything. God made even this great creature, and God has power over all of his creation. And that's the theological principle we are to draw from this. So let's be humble in our acknowledgement of that. And I'm really just going to leave the verses up on the screen throughout the whole video, likely just as we jump from verse to verse very quickly. It's going to be a very diversified teaching in that regard, just jumping around. But let us also notice that the Leviathan can be just a general term for an aquatic animal, a large aquatic animal, sort of like the Behemoth, right? We established that the Behemoth likely is either an elephant or a hippopotamus. But really, if someone sees a large land animal, they can rightly call it a behemoth. In the same way, we are going to kind of narrow it down to what this Leviathan actually is. But nonetheless, a large aquatic animal could still be considered a Leviathan no matter what it is. So there is that reality. It could just be a general term rather than a distinct description of a particular animal. And as we look at Job 41, as I mentioned, we're going to look at Psalm and Isaiah as well. But really, it seems like Job 41 is the most descriptive traits, or the way it describes Leviathan is the most descriptive in this chapter. And as we look at a particular verse in Isaiah, and a particular verse in Psalm, when it mentions Leviathan, it doesn't seem like it's actually speaking of the animal here described in Job 41, but rather nations. So let us be cognizant of that just because something says Leviathan, we must look at the context to see if it's speaking of the actual animal or if it's used metaphorically to describe God's judgment, as we're going to see. And lastly, before we get into Job 41 here, we must recognize that this could be describing an animal that we have never discovered. You know, the ocean is a very deep place, a very great place. And who knows, there could be a ginormous creature here described in Job 41, a singular Leviathan that is a massive creature that fits this description perfectly. That is a possibility. Likely it's a modern day animal that we can recognize, but it may not be. And we have to have the humility to understand that God can create such a great beast that we have never seen before. As we get here in Job chapter 41 first, let's look at the location of the Leviathan. Here in verse 1 and verse 2 of Job chapter 41, we see kind of where this animal dwells. It says, "Canst thou draw out Leviathan with a hook, or his tongue with a cord which thou lettest down? Canst thou put an hook into his nose, or bore his jaw through with a thorn?" And then in verse 7, "Canst thou fill his skin with barbed irons, or his head with fish spears?" And so how does this kind of describe the location of the Leviathan? Well, it seems to be some kind of aquatic animal because they're using fishing spears, they're using fishing hooks to kind of draw the animal out. And so it seems to be a more aquatic animal, maybe not necessarily fully aquatic. It might be an amphibious animal, but nonetheless they are using fishing equipment, fishing tools to draw out the Leviathan. Now the point here is saying that you can't do it. The Leviathan is too great. But it's still giving us the idea that you would use fishing equipment, fishing materials to try to draw out the Leviathan with a fishing hook. And we go to verse 31 of Job 41. It mentions that the Leviathan is in the deeps of the water. In verse 31 and 32, "He made the deep to boil like a pot. He made the sea like a pot of ointment. He made a path to shine after him." One would think the deep to be Ori. So we see it describing the deep, like the ocean, the sea. Likely, maybe the Mediterranean Sea. But as we're going to see, when it's talking about deep, we don't really know how deep it could be. It might just be speaking of a river, maybe the Jordan River, the Nile River. Not necessarily a deep sea, as we might think in our minds, a great ocean. But it could just be a river. But nonetheless, we see that he is located in the river, or in the water, in the body of water, whatever it might be. He's located in it, and he causes it to boil like a pot, like stir up, get fizzy and fuzzy, and he leaves a path behind him. So we see that idea. But also, we go here for a moment to Psalm chapter 104, verse 25 through verse 26. We see it mentioning the Leviathan is in the deep as well. It says, "So is this great and wide sea, wherein are the things creeping innumerable, both small and great beasts. There go the ships. There is that Leviathan, whom thou hast made to play therein." So again, we're seeing that God made the Leviathan. But it says here that there go the ships. There are ships. And when I think of a ship, I think of a ginormous ship. But it may not be some great ship. Just a little ship that you could easily sail through a Mediterranean Sea, or maybe down the Nile River or the Jordan River. Just a boat type ship. Not some great ship necessarily, although it could be. But it says there is that Leviathan. So the Leviathan is clearly in the body of water here. And he's playing in the body of water. And he's great there in the body of water. And this could be in reference to a whale, particularly. For I don't want to say what I think it is yet. I want to just kind of just read the text and see. But it's saying that it goes in the deep waters, right? Great and wide sea. This could be referencing the Mediterranean Sea. And whales have been found in the Mediterranean Sea. And so that's why I want us to understand this. Like, Job 41, the description of the Leviathan may not be what the Leviathan is speaking here in Psalm 104:26. Again, the Leviathan can just be a general term for a great aquatic animal. And so this could very well, even if we don't think Job 41 is speaking of the whale, this here in Psalm 104:26 could be speaking of the whale. So we must understand that it may not be this one type creature that we think in our minds, but it's a general term for a large animal that is in the ocean or the sea or the rivers. We must have that in mind as we continue on. But just notice that in contrast to the Leviathan, or in contrast to the Behemoth, the Leviathan is an aquatic animal. He dwells in the water, and it may not be some great deep ocean. It may be just the depths of the river or the depths of the sea, like the Mediterranean Sea. But now if we go back to Job chapter 41, we're going to look at the physical characteristics of the Leviathan. So we see that he does dwell in the water somewhat. Maybe not permanently, maybe not always, but he does dwell in the water. He is an aquatic animal, at the very minimum, an amphibious animal. But if we go to verse 14 of Job chapter 41, we see that there are many teeth in his mouth. Who can open the doors of his face? His teeth are terrible round about. So Leviathan is an animal that has teeth all around its mouth. Many teeth, mighty teeth it seems. They're terrible. They're great. They're terrifying in a sense. They're fearful because of the greatness of its teeth. And likewise, if we go to verse 7, we see that the Leviathan has flesh. But as we go to verse 15 through verse 17, we're going to see that flesh is covered by scales. So canst thou fill his skin with barbed irons? So we know, of course, it has a skin. All animals who have scales will have skins underneath the scales, of course, but it's still important to note that. But now if we go down to verse 15 to verse 17, his scales are his pride, shut up together as with a close seal. One is so near to another that no air can come between them. They are joined one to another. They stick together that they cannot be sundered. So we see this Leviathan here described in Job 41 has scales all over its body. And they're tight-knit scales. They're strong scales. Right? The scales are his pride. That they are like shields to this animal. And they protect this animal. And then likewise in verse 23 as well. The flakes of his flesh are joined together. They are firm in themselves. They cannot be moved. And this isn't necessarily speaking about the scales, but really all the other flesh of this animal are tight. And they're not just hanging loose. But the animal is a very tight animal. Its skin is tight. Its scales are tight. It's not filled with much fat that just hangs over on its body. It's a very muscular animal. A very tight animal. It has hard flesh. And so as we see here described that it has scales, that these scales are joined together. As far as known whale species, this does not fit the description of a whale. Whales are mammals. They don't have scales. They just have blubber and skin and much fat. And that fat can be dense and thick, of course, but it's not a scale. It's not like a shield. It's not that rough idea we think of when we think of a scale. And so really it does not fit the description of a whale here in Job 41. But notice here in verse 18, We look at the color of its eyes for a further description of what this animal might be. By his neesings, and we'll get to that, it means sneezing, like when the animal sneezes. A light does shine, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. So if his eyelids are like the dawn of day, we have a yellowish, reddish, orangish color. Or that's what, when the sun arises, what we see in the sky. That sort of color type, whether it be yellowish, reddish, or orangish, depending on the day, depending on the atmosphere. We see those kinds of colors. And so we can assume, I believe, that this animal has that kind of color eye. A yellowish, reddish, orangish color. And as we go on to verse 19 to verse 20, we see that this animal has nostrils. But not only does it have nostrils, but the nostrils are close to its face. And we'll see why that's important. But out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils go with smoke, as of a seething pot or cauldron. So the fact that he has nostrils in conjunction with his mouth, right? So if these burning lamps are going out of his mouth and the smoke's going out of his nostrils, it appears to me that these things are close to one another. So when you think of a fish, first of all, fish don't have nostrils. So we kind of eliminate a great fish, at least a known great fish. Again, it could be a creature we don't know. But then you think of a whale as well. The whale has a nostril, has a blowhole, but it's not near its mouth, right? It's on top of its back. And so this implies, it appears to me, that the mouth and the nostril are close to one another. So it seems that it eliminates a great fish. It seems that it eliminates a whale, since the whale's mouth and nostrils are far apart from each other and not near each other. So it's unlikely a whale here described in Job 41. But if we go on to verse 22, we also see that it appears that this Leviathan has a neck. In his neck remaineth strength, and sorrow is turned into joy before him. And again, fish do not have necks. Whales do not have necks. So we kind of think, apparently, seemingly, we can eliminate some kind of whale-like creature as far as the description of Job 41. Again, the passage in Psalm 104 could be speaking of a whale, because the Leviathan can be used as a general term. But here in Job 41, it does not seem that the whale is being described very accurately, if the whale is being described. Maybe it is. These things could be sort of metaphorical, but it does not seem to be the whale. But also, if we go to verse 30 of Job chapter 41, we see that the whale has the creature Leviathan has a strong, sharp underbelly. It says, sharp stones are under him. He spreadeth his sharp pointed things upon the mire. And so the challenge with verse 30 is when it says sharp stones are under him, it might be referring to the fact that it has a rough underbelly, and so it can lay on sharp items, sharp rocks, and not be affected by them. Or it could be speaking that literally the underbelly of this animal is sharp, is pointy. And if it is that, then that kind of makes the description more obscure, because I don't know of any animal that has like pointy things on its stomach. Right? Most animals have an exposed underbelly, even if they have a rough exterior on their back. But he said he spread his sharp pointed things upon the mire, so he drags himself upon the depths of the river or the ocean, the sea, whatever it might be. He like kind of goes through the mud and leaves a path behind him. So those are the main physical traits of the Leviathan here shown in Job 41. But there are some unique traits I want us to look at. First of all, in verse 18 to verse 21, we see that this animal, just a plain reading without metaphorical thinking, this animal supposedly breathes fire. And of course, if that is the case, this cannot be an animal that we know of in the modern day. We don't know of any animal described in these terms that can also breathe fire out of its mouth. But maybe, possibly, it's just a metaphorical statement or hyperbolic statement of the animal. But in Job 41:18, by his neesings, again, by his sneezings, when he sneezes, a light doth shine, and his eyes are like the eyelids of the morning. Out of his mouth go burning lamps, and sparks of fire leap out. Out of his nostrils goeth smoke, as out of a seething pot or cauldron. His breath kindleth coals, and a flame goeth out of his mouth. So again, it just seems very, if we're going to read that in a literal sense, it seems very clear that this animal, this creature, can breathe fire. And this might be where many people who make movies and exaggerations of things, like we have the creature like the dragon. And it seems likely they probably get it from this Job passage, that a great dragon who can breathe fire and destroy much things. But you see, it's likely just referring to the steam that comes out of his mouth. When you think of an animal who's been underwater for a long time, holding in his breath, getting a hot sort of air built up into his lungs. And as he comes out of the water, immerses himself and breathes, it's kind of like this steamy look. This vapor comes out of his nostrils, comes out of his mouth. And so it might just be speaking of that, not actual literal fire, but kind of like a vapor, kind of like a smoke that just comes out of his mouth after the hot air is released from his nose, released out of his mouth. It could simply just be that, and this is a hyperbolic language to describe that process. Likely the case, but again, this is not beyond the capability of God creating, right? God could create such an animal as this. And so that's not to be questioned. But is that really what's describing here? I can't rule it out entirely, but doubtful, right? Doubtful. But now if we continue on and we go to Psalm chapter 74, verse 14, we're going to see an interesting way that the Leviathan is described. But we start in verse 13, actually, just to give some context. He says, "Thou didst divide the sea by thy strength. Thou breakest the heads of the dragons in the waters. Thou breakest the heads of Leviathan in pieces, and gavest him to be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness. Thou didst cleave the fountain in the flood, thou driest up mighty rivers." So right here in verse 14, he says, "Thou breakest the heads of Leviathan." And so a unique characteristic, does this Leviathan have many heads? Well, if you really look at the broader context of Psalm 74, it appears here Leviathan is speaking of Egypt. Leviathan here is speaking of Pharaoh and the princes of Pharaoh and the captains of Pharaoh. Because if you look at verse 13, "Thou didst divide the sea by thy strength," it appears that might be speaking of the Red Sea. Right? The psalmist is here kind of reflecting on what God has done for them. And so if we think of the Red Sea, how God parted the Red Sea and then crushed the armies of Egypt in the Red Sea, in a metaphorical sense, it does seem that thou breaks the heads of dragons in the waters. That's speaking of he's destroying the army of Israel. But then here with the heads of the Leviathan, it could be speaking of just the captains of Egypt, the Pharaoh himself, these different heads, these different rulers, if you will, these different people in power, that God broke the heads of Leviathan in pieces. So really, it does seem as speaking metaphorically about Egypt, rather than a physical Leviathan having many heads, as we might think of mythological creatures. I forget that one creature in mythology where you cut its head off and another one grows, the Hydra, I believe. So I don't think it's talking about that kind of thing with the Leviathan. But even if you want to take this as a literal thing, well, Leviathan, again, could be a category for an animal, or a category for a large aquatic species. And so even if you want to take it literally, that the head's Leviathan could just be the fact that there are many types of Leviathan and they're all being destroyed. And I will say Leviathan does seem singular here, so maybe not. Maybe you can't take it that way. But it does seem as speaking of Egypt, and the nation of Egypt being Leviathan, and the heads of this Leviathan being the people in power over Egypt at that time they were destroyed in the Red Sea. So it appears to me. Again, it could be some Hydra-type creature, but doubtful. It's likely speaking of Egypt here. And we kind of see something similar in Isaiah chapter 21, where we see, again, this term for Leviathan is used as a judgment that God is bringing. It says, "In that day the Lord with his sore and great and strong sword shall punish Leviathan, the piercing serpent, even Leviathan, that crooked serpent. And he shall slay the dragon that is in the sea." And so this doesn't really seem like it's talking about a physical animal-type Leviathan. For if God is punishing, if God is bringing judgment, why is he punishing, a random animal in the ocean? Unless this animal has a greater spiritual meaning, which it could be. We see in Revelation and we see in Genesis that the devil is known as a serpent. The devil is known as like a dragon-type creature. So it could be speaking of that, but I don't think it's an actual physical, animal Leviathan here. It's used as a metaphor to describe God bringing judgment. Here in Isaiah, likely Assyria or Babylon. So Leviathan's not always the animal. It's sometimes just described and used metaphorically as one of God's enemies, as one of the enemies of Israel. So we must recognize that. So can we say that, well, right here it calls the Leviathan a serpent, so maybe the Leviathan's a snake-type creature. Or maybe he's a dragon-type creature. Maybe. But again, this passage in particular is not physically trying to describe the Leviathan, but rather using the Leviathan as a term to talk about the enemies of God. So we must keep that in mind. But really, as a summary here, the Leviathan is likely a category of animal rather than a specific one type of animal. So what is the Leviathan? What do we think it might be? Well, based off the descriptions we've read in Job chapter 27, Job chapter 41. I was thinking Isaiah 27. Job chapter 41, it does not appear that the Leviathan is a whale. It does not appear that the Leviathan is a fish, right? Because a whale does not have scales, and a fish does not have nostrils, and neither one of them have a neck. So it does not seem to be that it's describing a whale here. It could be. And like I said, in Psalm 104, it really definitely could be speaking of a whale. But as far as the description in Job 41, it does not appear to be a whale. It does not appear to be a great fish, but something different. As we saw in Isaiah 27, maybe it's a serpent. But again, that seems to be describing more of the judgment of God coming upon a nation more than trying to physically describe what the Leviathan looks like. So it does not seem that we can really take that and put into Job 41 and think, well, this is what God is speaking of. Again, maybe, but it does not seem fair to the text to do so. But as we see in those passages of Psalm and Isaiah, right, God's bringing judgment rather than describing the animal. So what is the Leviathan? Well, in my opinion, the Leviathan is likely a crocodile. As far as the modern animals that we view today, the crocodile fits much of the description described in Job chapter 41. Maybe it's a whale, right? We see that it abides in the deep. And we look at a crocodile. It does not abide in the deep, so to speak. Right? It abides in rivers, the Nile River, the Jordan River. It abides in these rivers that don't get any really deeper than 50 feet. But maybe that is deep comparatively, right? We wouldn't think that's deep compared to the Mediterranean Sea or the ocean. But as far as a river, that could be considered deep. And so we can't really put a number on what the Bible means when it says deep. So it's kind of hard to tell there. But it does seem to be the crocodile, right? The crocodile has circulating teeth around his mouth. The crocodile has yellow eyes, right? Eyes like the dawn. And the crocodile has scales. Sharp scales, strong scales, mighty scales. And also a plus, right? If we compare this to the behemoth is likely a hippopotamus or an elephant. It could be some creature we've never discovered or creature in the past. But as looking at Job chapter 40, it appears the behemoth is a hippopotamus or maybe an elephant-type creature. And this behemoth lives around the Nile River. In the same way, a crocodile lives around the Nile River. So just in geographically speaking, these animals would be near one another. It kind of makes sense. So that would be a plus that the Leviathan here, if it is a crocodile and the behemoth is a hippopotamus, they live near one another. And so that would kind of be concise. That would make a lot of sense. But also, the crocodile is a dragonish type creature. Of course, when we think of a dragon, we think of a huge animal with wings and scales all over his body that are great, and he's a mighty creature that flies and breathes fire. But we just bring it down a little bit. The alligator, or crocodile rather, does have a lot of similar traits to the dragon in his appearance. Of course, not as mighty, not as great. It can't fly, can't physically breathe fire. But just in the look of its head, the look of its eyes, the look of its scales on its body, it does really look like a dragon. And so there's a dragonish type element to the crocodile as we see in just looking at them. And compared to Scripture, how it spoke a lot of a dragon, it does match in some ways. At least the medial portrayal of a dragon, right? That scaly, armored animal that is mighty and powerful. Now, I will say the things that might go against this being the crocodile described in Job 41 is that, again, it's not in deep seas. And again, how deep is deep here being described? I don't know. But obviously, when we read about ships and them drawing out Leviathan with a hook, we naturally, at least I do, I think of like a great ocean, a great sea that has great depths. And here the Leviathan, being the crocodile, would not match that idea. And also the crocodile does not have a sharp underbelly, right? The underbelly of the crocodile is very soft. And so when it talks about it being pointy and jagged, that doesn't match the crocodile. But again, that might just be speaking of rocks, and the crocodile can lay on these sharp rocks because while its underbelly is soft, it's still scaly, and it still is kind of rough in that way. But that could be a knock at this not being the crocodile. And then, of course, the most obvious one is that the crocodile cannot breathe fire. Like, it physically cannot breathe fire. So if those few verses in Job 41 are merely speaking metaphorically, well, then we can say it's the crocodile. But if it's speaking very literally about breathing fire, as we think of a dragon in Lord of the Rings, for example, breathing fire, well, then, yeah, we can't equate that or put that on the description of the crocodile. But if it's metaphorical, we really can, based off the steam and the smoke that just might come out of its mouth because of hot breath. So I do believe it's the crocodile, but as with the behemoth, this could be a totally unique creature that we don't know of today. If you go on Google and type in Leviathan, you're going to get an array of images of these mighty, mighty ocean creatures. And it's fun to think that that's what it looks like. It's fun to think that God would create such a mighty creature and then slay it. Because again, it just shows God's power. But we don't need it to look like that to know that God is all powerful. God is almighty. And so it might be one of those Google type images that you see, but it's likely not the case. Maybe, but likely not the case. But as we get into the future episodes of Job 41, we're going to see more of just not the physical description of the Leviathan, but the mighty Leviathan. And then God's ultimate argument of why he's describing the Leviathan this way. That this sea creature which God made is so mighty. How much more mighty is the God of all creation? So I know this wasn't very deep study. I know this wasn't very, speaking of the glory of God in a sense, but I just want us to describe the Leviathan. I want us to see the description that God gives it and establish what it might be. Crocodile, large aquatic animal like a whale, or maybe some mythical type creature, not fake, but as we would look at in stories that we've never discovered. It's possible. But either way, always remember that you are not alone. Jesus loves you. I love you. Have a blessed rest of your day.